At this hour, a sudden and unexpected tremor across the judicial and political landscape in this country, less than one day after the passing of a Supreme Court justice. Hello, everyone. I am Joy Reid at MSNBC World Headquarters in New York, sitting in for Melissa Harris-Perry, and we are going to talk this hour about how Justice Scalia's death will impact the issue of voting rights. We know there's some important cases before the court that are very much impacted by his absence. The question of voting equality, which the justices are set to take up in two cases involving the principle of one person, one vote. Now, the plaintiffs in a Texas case are asking the court to decide which people should count when distributing political power in the creation of legislative districts. At the heart of the case is the question of whether to draw those lines based on the total population of the district or based only on the number of eligible voters. Excluding non-eligible voters could dramatically shift the balance of political power from urban to rural areas in states with large immigrant populations in particular. Now, there's a second case brought by a group of Republican voters in Arizona. It argues that congressional districts drawn by an independent commission violate the Constitution by giving an unfair advantage to voters of color in Democratic districts. And just this week, another case involving redistricting in North Carolina arrived before the court. In this case, a three-judge panel agreed with voting rights plaintiffs who argued that when Republicans took over the North Carolina General Assembly in 2011, they violated the constitutional rights of black voters by using illegal racial quotas to redraw two congressional districts in the state. Now, unless the Supreme Court agrees with the state's appeal to block the ruling, the state has until Friday to redraw those lines. The Supreme Court has not yet decided whether to intervene, but another decision made years ago by the court's conservative majority, led by Justice Scalia, will influence how North Carolinians vote in just a few weeks when they head to the polls for early primary voting on March 3rd. Now, because for the first time, voters in the state will be casting a ballot under the state's highly contentious voter ID law. It's a law that North Carolina was free to enact without any federal oversight after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013. North Carolina's voter ID law will be in effect during the primaries, even as the question of its legality remains unanswered. Because the trial in the federal lawsuit to overturn the law was just wrapped up last week, and a verdict is not expected before the primary. But the plaintiffs in that case have not given up the fight. The North Carolina NAACP, building on its Moral Mondays movement, yesterday held a large rally where thousands of people marched for voting rights into the state's Capitol building. The march was followed by an afternoon of voter training and education in anticipation of the upcoming primary. And here with me now from Charlotte, North Carolina, is the leader of that movement, Reverend William Barber. He's the president of the North Carolina NAACP and author of The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. Here with me in New York is Ari Berman, reporter for The Nation magazine and author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. And joining me from Washington, D.C. is MSNBC's very own Reverend Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation. And Reverend Al, I do want to come to you first to just talk with us about, in the big picture, what is at stake regarding voting rights in this choice for a replacement for Justice Scalia, and the fact that Republicans are saying they won't confirm anyone to replace him.
Well, I think that it is very, very, very crucial where we are in terms of voting rights in front of this court. Let's remember this court had just taken out Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, and now we're seeing them, as you just outlined, having to consider both the North Carolina case, the Texas case. The ramifications of those decisions will really gear where we are going in terms of voting rights, or where we're not going for the next generation or two. Whoever is selected by the president, if confirmed, could tip the Supreme Court for the next 50 years. You have to remember, Joy, we've been under a conservative court for the last half century. If President Obama can get a center to left of center nominee in, he can tip the scales for the next 50 years. If he cannot, and we get a Republican president and eventually they make the decision, we will be in serious, serious difficulty. So there's a lot riding on this, and front and center will be the voting rights of citizens in this country, which they've been chipping away at with this conservative court, to where we are in real trouble.
Yeah, and Reverend Sharpton makes a really good point, Reverend Barber, because that means that the next election is going to be really important. And in your state of North Carolina, that is part of what's being litigated, not just in voter ID, but these 2 congressional districts that were redrawn by the court. Talk a little bit about how those North Carolina cases really impact voting rights in your state and in the country.
Well, you know, with the death of Justice Scalia, we must mourn his death, but we have to move away from his philosophy. The fact of the matter is, we have seen the nightmare we all predicted after Shelby, that you remove Section 5 enforcement, and we've had an unleashing of what things we have not seen since the end of the first Reconstruction. Critically, we are in a time where we have less voting rights now than we had in 1965. That is something that this nation should be deeply concerned about. And right now, the one issue we're not talking about in our elections. If you look at all the debates, neither Democrats or Republicans have really talked about voting rights and what they will do to restore the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, they're asking people to vote for them, but they're not talking about what they will do to restore the Voting Rights Act to protect the voting rights. So that means that, for instance, we're coming south. Every member of the CBC, their voting districts, their legislative districts are at jeopardy. Reverend Pickney, who is in South Carolina, who passed, we say we love him, but the very district is at jeopardy because we have Scalia said that the Voting Rights Act, for instance, was an entitlement. So the real question is, in this election, if you want to deal with race, you want to deal with Black Lives Matter, health care, we should be drilling down on where do these candidates stand on restoration of the Voting Rights Act, full restoration, particularly in the South. And lastly, Joy, what I say to you is, at a time when the Black and the Latino vote have more potential with progressive white votes to break open the solid South, we have less voter protection than we've had since 1965 and more attacks on the right to vote since the 19th century. That's why thousands of people gathered yesterday, and we were able to sign up over 5,000 persons for a voluntary army and 3,000 faith communities, because the issue of voting rights should be at the center of every discussion in this election. How can you ask people to vote for you, but you're not dealing with how you're going to protect the very right to vote?
Yeah, indeed. And Ari, you know, this was the subject, obviously, of your book, because let's talk about the remaining justices on the conservative side, because, you know, Reverend Barber and Reverend Sharpton just made the point. Voting rights are not sacrosanct to every member of the court in terms of the Voting Rights Act, right?
No, absolutely. You had 5 justices on the court who led a broad counter-revolution against the civil rights laws of the 1960s, particularly the Voting Rights Act. That was John Roberts' role when he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, was opposition to the Voting Rights Act. Roberts famously said that he wanted to make sure that violations of the Voting Rights Act were not too easy to prove. That's what he did 3 decades later when he became Chief Justice, along with Scalia, Thomas, and the rest of the justices, that this has been a key part of their mandate, is to roll back the civil rights laws of the 1960s, which are now under attack. And Reverend Barber made a great point. We've had 15 debates now, but no questions about voting rights, even though this is the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And 16 states, including South Carolina, which is voting soon, including North Carolina, which will vote after that, have new restrictions in place for the first presidential cycle this year. So this is a huge, huge issue, but it's being treated by the media as a fringe issue instead of one of the most fundamental issues shaping the election.
Right, and you have Clarence Thomas on the court who wanted to also delete Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If potentially another justice, let's say, were to retire and Republicans had a 6-3 majority, you could see the entire Voting Rights Act fall, right?
Well, absolutely. You mentioned the Evanwell case earlier about the drawing of congressional districts, and that's huge. But there are also challenges in the lower courts to restrictive voting laws in places like Texas and North Carolina. Those are going to come up before the Supreme Court, most likely on appeal. Then the Supreme Court's going to have a chance to further gut the Voting Rights Act. John Roberts in the Reagan Justice Department, his opposition was to the remaining part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. So this is one reason why this election is so critical, because the Voting Rights Act remains very unsettled right now before the court.
Indeed. And Reverend Sharpton, you recently interviewed both Hillary Clinton and Senator Bernie Sanders, the 2 Democrats who are competing for the Democratic nomination. Did they talk to you about the issue of making voting rights and the restoration of the Voting Rights Act primary in the conversations that they're having with voters?
No, which is part of the challenge. In fact, we meet the leading civil rights organization heads. We meet with Clinton on Tuesday, and we meet again collectively with Senator Sanders on Thursday. That's the top of our list because Senator Sanders is in the Senate. When they sent the voting rights bill back, or the Voting Rights Act back to the Congress, after they negated it, we were all sitting there in the oral arguments after they negated the map and said, draw a new map. I would, if I were Bernie Sanders, be standing up saying, let's draw the map, whether they would go with it or not. They have a central position that they could be using in terms of profile to make this the issue. 15 states that never had a change in voting laws are now going to be voting this year for the first time with those laws changed. Voter ID, early voting canceled. So we're talking about a vote coming out and whether there'll be a turnout when we're not talking about the turnoff that has happened in some of the state laws and by what the Supreme Court did in terms of the Voting Rights Act. And I think it is not only in our interest, it's in the candidates' interest, and they're ignoring it at their own peril, both parties.
Yeah, indeed. And Reverend Barber, in terms of your state and the movement that you are leading to try to get people to focus on this issue, talk to the country about what the stakes are for voting rights if the Voting Rights Act were to go away, if the entire thing were to be struck down.
North Carolina is our Selma. We saw immediately after Shelby, on the day that Shelby came down, one of our senators said, now that the headache has been removed. And they changed 40 laws. It wasn't just photo ID. It was same-day registration, ending it, early voting, rolling it back, ending out-of-precinct voting, ending straight ticket voting. And they went after 17-year-olds being able to register. This is atrocious. We've had a 2-year filibuster, longer than Strom Thurmond filibustered the 64 Civil Rights Act. And I would say respectfully, it's good for them to meet with civil rights leaders and those who are in organizations. But what they need to be doing is meeting with Rosanelle Eaton, who's 93 years old, who would not be able, who almost lost her right to vote after voting 61 years. They need to be, these candidates, talking to people who have lost their right to vote in these states. For instance, Tom Tillis won our state, but he didn't win. We know 75,000 votes were suppressed. He only won by 30,000 votes. We have a legislature that's unconstitutionally constituted, that's been writing laws in our state. And this nation needs to understand what you see happening in North Carolina is just the tip of the iceberg if we don't fix this and what could be happening across the country. We have a chance now to break open the solid South. And at the very time we have that opportunity, we have less voting rights protection than we have had since 1965. I say to the candidates, come down and have sessions with people, with the people on the ground in the South, not in the North somewhere, in the South, and deal with the people who are having their voting rights abridged and annihilated in this attempt to stop a third Reconstruction.
And Ari Berman, let's put back up the list of the Senate Judiciary Committee majority members. Tom Tillis, who Reverend Barber just mentioned, is on the Judiciary Committee that would have to consider whether consider an Obama nominee. David Vitter of Louisiana is on that list. Ted Cruz, who came out and said there should be no nominee, is on the Judiciary Committee, as well as John Cornyn of Texas. Both Texas senators both sit on the Judiciary Committee. This is, in large part, a Southern committee that will decide whether or not there's a nominee.
Well, and that's disturbing because we've seen a Southernization of the Republican Party, not just in terms of its membership, as you showed, but also in terms of its ideology. The rolling back of the Voting Rights Act, attack on civil rights. These are things that were concentrated in the South 50 years ago, but they've spread to the North. We're now having fights over voter suppression in Wisconsin and in Kansas and in Ohio. And so this has captured the Republican Party. This ideology of voter suppression has captured the Republican Party. And we said before the death of Scalia that the Supreme Court was a crucial issue in the 2016 election. Many people didn't get that, but now we see it front and center. And so if you care about these issues of voting rights, of civil rights, of racial justice and equality, then the future of the Supreme Court is one of the most important issues, if not the most important issue in the next election.
Yeah, indeed. Ari Berman, Reverend William Barber in Charlotte, North Carolina, and of course, Reverend Al Sharpton coming to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
All right, and up next, The new opening on the Supreme Court was the topic of conversation at last night's debate.